Welcome to the Turnpike Sports Spotlight. Dave Weishaupt with you. It's been over 5 years since the U.S. Supreme Court struck down PASPA to allow states to legalize sports betting. And since 2018, it's been one big story in the industry after another, whether it's new states coming on board, the new rules and regulation, and what operators are dominating and what others are folding up or getting acquired. The news has been nonstop. And when we want to find out the latest in the industry, we always ask our favorite guest and brand new Florida resident, Adam Small from Better Collective. Adam, as always, welcome back to the show.
Man, it's so great to be back. I can't remember when the last time I was on was, but I love this show. It's always been one of my favorites, and thanks for highlighting my new home.
Yeah,
in Florida.
Yeah, congratulations. A big move to Florida. I hope everyone's settled down now. Everyone's getting into a routine now down in the Sunshine State.
It's awesome. Loving it here. The kids are really happy. We bike everywhere all the time. It's a little hot this time of year, a little hot, and the weather's a little wild. We get like these 100-degree days, and then we have these crazy thunderstorms. But we're loving it so far, and hopefully I'm actually able to bet on sports here at some point, because that seems to be like a very will they, won't they situation.
Well, let's talk about that. You brought it up about Florida, and that state seems to be one of the biggest stories in the sports betting industry. I want to get your take on the status of sports betting in Florida. I mean, I talk to a lot of people in the sports betting industry, and they tell me the situation is fluid, which is usually a polite way to say it's very confusing. But you're but you're down there and you see what's going on. So as we're speaking today, what's happening in the state of Florida with regard to sports betting?
Well, it's like, you can back up and just say, like, at least we're not California, right?
Yeah.
But, no, I mean, I kind of like take this bird's eye view of everything because, as you know, Dave, I've been observing and been part of this whole thing since before the PASPA repeal happened.
Sure.
And, at that point, we had New Jersey that was clearly coming in, and then West Virginia earlier that year said that they would do it, and Pennsylvania similarly. They had passed laws that said sports betting would happen if the Supreme Court overruled PASPA, or if it was allowed federally. And since then, we've now got more than half the states in the country involved. But the big four states, Florida, New York, Texas, and California, have kind of all been white whales in their own unique ways, all four of them. And if you'd asked me 3 years ago which of these states we'd have by 2023, I'd probably have said none of them. So The fact that we now have New York with a fairly vibrant sports betting market, and Florida with a possible, once in future sports betting market happening, I think it's a fairly positive development. So, you're asking what's going on down here. What's my take? Mm-hmm. Well, it is an interesting situation. It's a state that has decided for, the majority of the gambling stuff that goes on here, that it runs through the Seminole tribe, which owns Hard Rock. Playtech now, the Israeli, I believe, gambling company now owns part of Hard Rock, but the Seminole tribe is far and away the dominant player in this game, and they were able to secure a legislative victory that gave them a sports betting monopoly in the state. But before that could really fully play out, it got tied up in the courts and continues to be. And the tribe got a ruling in its favor recently that said that they could launch online sports betting in the state, but it may get repealed again, may end up in front of the U.S. Supreme Court even. And because of that, there's some uncertainty around whether or not they're going to relaunch until this is fully settled. And I think it makes a lot of sense. If I were them, I'd be very hesitant about it. You got to think that from a customer viewpoint, where it's not just Hard Rock, it's also, the offshores and their local bookie and so on. If you're an existing sports bettor or someone thinking about betting on sports, and you see Hard Rock come online as an option that's saying they're the only real legit game in town, and you move your business there, and then like a few weeks later you find out that they're no longer in town, you really have had a negative experience in a variety of ways. You may not trust them as much with what they say. You may not take them so seriously next time they say they're the only game in town, once this is all settled. So I think they're very hesitant to temporarily launch if they're not sure it's going to be permanent. And my understanding is that their lawyers are evaluating things and trying to decide what they want to do and how likely it is that they would have to go back offline, and we'll make a decision based on that.
Yeah, I'm very curious. Where does Florida go from here? I mean, are the state legislators getting involved with the issue? Are they coming up with some kind of plan or resolution? Are they waiting for the courts to have their final say in everything? What are you hearing down in Florida? Because this has been going back and forth a lot.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything about any specific legislative activity. I mean, obviously, the FanDuels and DraftKings of the world have, tried to weigh in and see if they could get an alternate solution down here, but it just doesn't look like that's at all likely to happen. I think that the real options are either, it's Hard Rock only or it's nothing. And I think it is going to be Hard Rock only. I just think it's a matter of time for this to all play out, and the possible additional levels of litigation that could happen. But no, I don't think the legislature really wants to get involved in this. They really don't like doing anything at all that pisses off the Seminoles. Mm-hmm. But I think they also just would rather not be doing anything at all on this. And it makes it easier, I think, just to say, well, we'll just wait and see what the courts say. I'm not even sure there's anything they can do.
Yeah,
so it's pretty crazy. I mean, I've been here a really short time. I'm not entirely sure how long and how often the Florida legislature is in session. But if it's anything like Texas, it's just kind of crazy how condensed everything is. I think Texas meets for like 3 months every 2 years or something like that. This is a state of 25 million people or whatever. You got a lot of business to do in that time, right?
Yeah, no, it's. I know they have a problem with their power grid. I can't believe they're not meeting every week on that one. But I'm glad you mentioned the Seminoles. I was talking to a lot of people about Florida and things like that, and anytime mobile sports betting gets into a state, we're usually talking about FanDuel or DraftKings. But when I think of Florida, I think of Hard Rock, and I'm wondering, will Hard Rock really still be dominant once FanDuel or DraftKings come into the picture? Do they have a real shot at being dominant, even above FanDuel or DraftKings?
You mean like, I guess, elsewhere in the country?
Right? Yeah, elsewhere in the country. It's either FanDuel or DraftKings, number one or number two. When I think Florida, I just automatically think Hard Rock, and I would think they would be the dominant site when Florida gets sports betting and online sports betting. I would think Hard Rock would be up there, right up on top.
Yeah, I mean, well, assuming they're, if they're the only one, which is looking like the most likely thing that's going to happen down here, then I mean, they're going to be huge, and it's going to obviously tilt the nationwide market share pretty hard in their direction. It's not going to put them above, FanDuel, DraftKings nationally, but having 100% of the market in Florida is actually going to be the biggest state that has sports betting, because I believe Florida's passed New York in population as of 10 or 15 years ago.
Sure.
So it's gonna make a big difference in their national footprint. But I also understand that Hard Rock's going to be going live in a number of states soon, and so they are finally, after a long time of talking about it, making a real push into the I guess, quote unquote, national sports betting market, the multi-state sports betting market, we'll say. And I think that they're for real. I think they're a really interesting player. I've been having these conversations for a year or so around just like this kind of the broader concept of this kind of second wave in the U.S., where you had the first wave of legalizations in like 2018, 2019, where a lot of states came in, and all the way through really even 2022 when New York came online, just had a steady stream of new states coming online. And it's still going on today. We're going to have North Carolina fairly soon. That's a really big state. Kentucky, kind of a mid-sized state, but these continue to happen. They're slowing down, but they're happening. And early on, it was just very clear, like FanDuel and DraftKings were the undisputed leaders. They were way, way, way ahead of the pack everywhere. And then, BetMGM started becoming a bit more relevant. Caesars started making a bit more of a push. They've struggled, but they've pushed. And there are a handful of other brands that have made an impact here and there. Bet365, I think, has done okay in Ohio, for example. But there's been a lot of talk about, what is the market going to look like in 5 or 10 years?
Yeah.
Is it still going to be this FanDuel, DraftKings, maybe BetMGM sort of group at the top, or are there going to be other operators that make a real push and become actually relevant? And my belief is that yes, there will be other operators that come into the mix and matter and possibly challenge for the top spot even in certain states. And then the question is, who are those operators? Which are the ones that have a chance? Because you see a lot of European operators. You saw 888 making a play in the U.S., Unibet, some of these brands, Tipico, that it's kind of like, you're incredulous, probably. I'm incredulous that these brands are going to make a difference. But on the other hand, you got Fanatics. They're very, very relevant U.S. footprint, just not in sports betting, but in sports, very relevant footprint. You've got Bet365, which is probably the class of the class globally in sports betting. How do they fit in once they really start investing in the U.S.? I think we're kind of getting a little taste of that in Ohio. They just didn't have the user base that FanDuel and DraftKings had, so they got more uphill climbing, but they could be relevant. I believe that they'll matter. I believe that Hard Rock is another one that is going to matter in the U.S. I think Hard Rock, has broad access to a lot of markets and to a lot of customers that both maybe in their actual databases, but certainly that are familiar with their brand, because they've been pretty ubiquitous in the U.S. for, the entirety of my life, I would say. I think that they'll make a play. I think that they will be relevant. I think that there are different constraints on them because of being owned by the Seminoles that have very specific goals compared to like a shareholder-owned brand like DraftKings.
Yeah.
And I think that, it's something that people may need to temper their expectations. My understanding is that the Seminoles place a very high priority on being profitable, on having a certain amount of revenue pouring in that, is being counted on to fund things that they need for the tribe. And so it's not quite as simple as like what DraftKings does, where they just go totally kamikaze everywhere and spend all their money and don't care how much they lose. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying, but bottom line is Hard Rock, it's a different company. They've got different goals, but I do think that they have a real chance to be relevant in a number of markets around the U.S.
Like I said, 2018 was when the U.S. Supreme Court struck down PASPA to allow states to offer sports betting within their borders. In your opinion, what is the state of the industry right now? I mean, I remember, the big issue when it first started was, we want people to use licensed sites and not offshore sites and things like that. Is that still a concern right now, or are people really, in Canada, every gray site has really become a legal regulated site. Is that still a concern in the U.S., and where do we go from here with regard to the industry?
I don't think it's as big of a concern now. I think it was something I was definitely hearing a lot of in 2018, 2019, and even earlier when it was just New Jersey doing online casino and poker, and a couple other, Nevada had poker and Delaware was doing their thing. And even then there was like a lot of talk of, oh God, why are we still letting people play on these offshores? But there were no other options. Right. Mm-hmm. So I think that, just the advertising prominence that this industry's had, being on all these football broadcasts and just having all these betting shows on every network and so on, that has had the intended effect of, blanketing the airwaves and billboards and so on. And people know that there's legal sports betting out there at this point. And you still see a lot of kind of the, I don't want to say quasi-legal because I believe it's fully legal, but it's unregulated kind of sports betting-ish stuff like Prize Picks and Underdog and Sleeper and some of these other games that are out there that are sort of alternative products for people that are into this space and that offer something different and aren't part of sort of that regulated sports betting regime, that are also, though, getting TV advertising and showing up in prominent places. Yeah. So it's a different spot. There's still kind of different groupings that are out there. But I don't think the offshores are super relevant, except in the states where there's no regulated products at all. I'm sure that if you live in California or whatever, and that there are lots and lots of people that are still gambling on offshore sites. I'm sure if you live in Texas, if you live in Georgia, where I used to live, and probably here in Florida too, that there's still a lot of people using those products. I mean, I knew neighbors in Georgia, and I'm talking, people in their 40s and 50s living in the suburbs who gambled online on offshore books all the time because that was what they had. So I think that's still going on. I think there's less talk around it. It's a quieter business these days, and probably a lot of the smaller and mid-sized ones have closed shop. But you got to also keep in mind that there are other black markets around the world that these guys can operate in as well, not just the U.S. So it's still a thriving business of sorts. But I think the attention just has really moved away from that in the industry, and it's more just focused on just other threats that are out there. I think that New York Times series that ran, I believe earlier this year or late last year, really highlighted some of the narrative concerns that are around the industry if they're allowed to take hold. If we don't do a careful and diligent enough job around problem gambling, harm mitigation and prevention, if we don't dedicate enough resources to helping people that have dealt with those issues, or to trying to keep them from gambling more, unregulated operators, I think there's a lot of prominence right now around scandals involving athletes gambling that have really damaging potential, from a narrative perspective. This thing with the Iowa quarterback, starting quarterback for a Big Ten football team. I mean, it's so stupid
it's ridiculous
that they did this, and it's not. It doesn't look like any kind of attempt to make money off information or anything like that. And I believe he wasn't even the starting quarterback when the bets were made.
Yeah.
But that being said, I mean, you really can see how things can spiral if the wrong things happen and the wrong narratives come into play. And I think the thing with the Alabama baseball coach in particular was an actually kind of scary thing that happened. And so we really need to be careful that we get ahead of this kind of stuff, that we have compelling counter narratives in the media about what the industry is doing, what the industry is investing to prevent impropriety, to get ahead of problem gambling, like I said. And just we need to recognize that this isn't just a big pot of gold. There are a bunch of legitimate social issues that result from gambling proliferation, and our industry, as the primary beneficiary of this proliferation, also needs to be the primary investor in mitigating and preventing these harms. So I think we just need to have a balanced and realistic perspective on this stuff, and continue to have voices out there like the Brianne Dowra Shawal is one of my favorites. Keith White from the National Council on Problem Gambling and his whole organization. I think these are really terrific people who have allied with the industry rather than taking an oppositional standpoint, that keeping voices like that at the forefront and really legitimately integrating their ideas into what we do as a business is really important. And I think there's a lot of that going on, and I'm keep hoping it's going to be more and more.
Well, let me ask you about the rules and regulations of sports betting. I'm sure everyone out there knows that in order to allow sports betting, states have to pass their rules and regulations. And one of the most interesting things in working in the gaming industry is that every state has different rules and regulations. I know a lot of people say they want to do the right thing, but the right thing changes from state to state. In your opinion, are the rules and regulations for sports betting effective in allowing the sports industry to grow in a responsible way, or do you think that the regulations for sports betting need to really adapt better to the changing markets? I mean, you mentioned these quasi sports betting outfits like Prize Picks and things like that. Do better rules and regulations have to be passed to really fit everyone in under the protections that the regulations of a state has for sports betting and sports betting like activity?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, with stuff like these sort of like fantasy betting hybrid sort of things, or
Yeah.
some would call it like house-backed fantasy betting or whatever house-backed fantasy games. Uh, I think that in these particular cases, yes, regulators need to get involved, and I hope they do. I think that these are really good companies for the most part, run by really good people. I'm personally friends with a lot of people at Prize Picks. Really admire that company.
Hmm.
Really big fan. Same with Underdog. I have just really, really great sentiment toward both those companies. And I think they exist in a space that's tricky right now because you can't be a regulated operator for a product that the state isn't regulating. So, I mean, it's the same thing that FanDuel and DraftKings were in years ago, where they were operating this daily fantasy product. It wasn't regulated. Some of the states were saying it wasn't legal, but the states also weren't creating a framework to provide this product. So, I mean, the options are basically never have this product or create it in a sort of like legal limbo or quasi legal status until the state does act. And we had this with online poker for years and years and years,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I mean, this is a real dilemma that people trying to innovate and create new markets face when it's a product that the state would typically be regulating. Is if it's not regulated today, um, it will never get regulated if it doesn't exist because the state's not going to regulate something that's not even out there. So you just kind of are stuck unless you're willing to kind of push those boundaries a little bit. And that's what's going on. I don't think it's anything nefarious or anything like that. It's just that we don't yet have a framework for it. And I really hope that what the games that Prize Picks offers and Underdog and others, which are really popular
Yeah.
and really great and innovative a lot of the time and stuff that you can't find elsewhere. I really hope that they do get worked into regulatory frameworks that allow them to provide these games, and also that consumers have the protection that the state provides, and so on. And I do think this will happen over time. And then there'll be more and more of the same kind of thing. And you see DraftKings and FanDuel now trying to pull the ladder up behind them and say, oh, can't believe all these guys operate these unregulated products, like as if they didn't do the same thing for years and years, right? Yeah. So, I mean, it's just it's a forever of cat and mouse that goes on in an industry like this. And as long as harm is prevented and mitigated as much as possible, we get decent outcomes at the end of the day.
Let me ask you about the issue of advertising. In the last couple of weeks, I've talked to Matt Hull from U.S. Integrity. I've talked to Eric Frank from Odds on Compliance. Sean Flaherty was a delegate from West Virginia. State Senator John Ford from Indiana. All of them brought up the issue of advertising, and it's a general feeling out there that it has to be some kind of rules and regulations and really some guidance on how much and what kind of advertising is appropriate for the sports betting industry. What do you think of this issue of advertising, and how do you see this issue being addressed and resolved for the industry?
That's really tricky.
Yeah.
It's really, really tricky, right? Because, there's a part of me that wants to say, like, the ones who are doing the most effective and best advertising are going to win the customers, and that should be how the industry approaches it. And then if you just seem like too much of a slime ball with what you're doing, that customers will react to that and not want to be a part of what you're offering. But I think in reality, it's a lot more complicated than that. I mean, I think I liken it more to financial products than I liken it to something like cigarettes. But that being said, there is a fear, and I think it's justified, that if the industry goes too far with the advertising, that you could get an outcome like what cigarettes got some years ago, where you're just kind of taken off the airwaves entirely. And I think the industry really, really wants to avoid that. That would be a really bad outcome. Mm-hmm. And you can see obviously that tobacco probably doesn't have a really awesome like long-term trajectory as a business. And thank goodness, right? Like I remember as a kid being on airplanes where people smoked in some parts. Thank goodness we don't deal with that anymore. We're sitting in the non-smoking section of a restaurant where like the next table over is in the smoking section, and so like you're in the smoking section, right? Yeah. So I'm glad that all that stuff's gotten better, but I don't want to be looking back in 10 years or 20 years at this industry and like laughing about, how ludicrous it was that we allowed sports betting to be advertised on TV for some period of time. Like, I really hope that that's not the way things go. And in order to make that happen, coming back to what I said a minute ago, I think we need to think about this more like financial products and probably regulate it more that way, where there are just more rules around what you're allowed to say and what you're not, and what you're allowed to actually offer and what you're not. And I think we've made a lot of progress on this already in a short time. For a while, we had this sort of framework where operators were calling bets risk-free that clearly were not.
Sure.
And that as an example, just for people who may be listening who aren't as familiar with this, I was in Tennessee a couple years ago, and I was doing a bunch of these risk-free bets. And by the way, I didn't get tricked. I knew exactly what I was doing, and I made a bunch of money on other ones. But on one of them, I signed up an account somewhere. I did the $1,000 maximum risk-free bet on something. It lost, and then I got credited back $1,000 free bet, which is basically what they would do. They would, give you a free bet to make if you lost the first bet. That was equivalent to how much you lost. But then I made that $1,000 free bet, and it also lost. And then I had nothing. So I had lost $1,000, which clearly means it was not a risk-free proposition. It was a better proposition than a normal bet because, my expected value is much higher if I get $1,000 bet, as a backup. If I lose the first one, that's much better than just getting nothing if you lose the first bet. But it's not the same as risk-free. And what they were calling those bets was just, quite frankly, wrong and misleading and probably dangerous. Not to someone like me, but to the average person, some grandma out there that sees this or whatever.
Yeah.
And I could really see very sympathetic and like legitimately sympathetic stories coming out of people who got screwed over by stuff like this. Because if you're a college student, $1,000 is a whole lot of money. I mean, if I lost, I remember one summer I lost a couple $100 in blackjack to my fraternity brothers, and I was like saving up the entire summer at my job to pay people back that I'd lost money to, that I didn't have money to pay. So losing $1,000 that you thought was risk-free could be really, really difficult for a 21 or 22-year-old. Or, just someone that doesn't have a lot of money. And I think that was a legitimately bad thing the industry was doing. And I think that we gotta make our game better around this stuff. And fortunately, there are a lot of people that care, that are paying attention to this, and improvements are already being made.
Now, one of the big stories in the industry is what's happening with the sportsbook operators themselves. I mean, last year we saw Fubo and Maximum Bet fall away. This year, Fox Bet is going away, and PointsBet US assets were acquired by Fanatics. Tell us about the sports betting operators themselves. Is this industry going to see more of these situations? And is that an indication that there may be too many sportsbooks out there? Is this what economists call a market correction? What do we take from the fact that some sports books are falling away?
I think it's totally expected. I think you ask anyone a few years ago and they would have said this kind of development would happen. They might not have made all the right predictions, probably not. But, in the case of Fox Bet, I was just talking about this recently on another show. I mean, Fox Bet was going to go away. That was going to happen. As soon as Stars Group got acquired by Flutter back in 2020, it was basically a foregone conclusion. They're not going to operate two different sports books like for too long in the US. It's like prohibitively expensive, from a licensing perspective and everything else. Maybe if Fox Bet had really taken off, this would have gone differently. But clearly they had the leading sports book in FanDuel. Like, why are they going to mess around with, and also ran? And then it didn't help that there's been litigation between FanDuel and Fox, and just there's a whole bunch of reasons that that this just didn't work out. But that was a unique situation. It happened. You got other situations like take a Unibet that maybe hasn't necessarily pulled out entirely, but is drastically scaled back their spending, or 888. Or like some of these books, particularly from overseas, that have scaled back their expansion plans. They just haven't gone into all these additional states that they said they were going into. You've had, Carousel Group that was operating Max and Bet that, was a pretty short-lived experiment, at least in the U.S. They were in Colorado and I think planned to be in more states, but I'm not sure they ever actually launched in more states, or if they did, it was very short-lived. So you got situations like that, just where people, come out and try to play and then realize it's tough and give up. And then you got other situations where you have a company like PointsBet that came in, had some decent plans, obviously had an uphill climb, dating back to, I remember hearing about them first in 2018. And my good buddy Seth Young was working there at the time and talked them up to me. And I actually played on there when they launched and found it pretty fun and interesting, just, a little bit unique, but they had a big uphill climb just based on user base and not having it compared to, companies that already had been operating in the US in some form or another. And so that was really tough. They had a hard time gaining really substantial market share. They were losing money in the US, a lot. And it was pretty clear for a long time that they didn't have like shareholder and, support within their own company to keep operating in the US for the long term. So, everyone knew they were going to get acquired. It was a question of who, and then, Fanatics swoops in and DraftKings does their thing, but Fanatics obviously ends up making the purchase. There's been a lot of talk about Rush Street for a long time, RSI, getting picked up by somebody. I think it's quite likely. There's talk about Tipico getting bought by someone. Mm-hmm. I think these things will continue to happen. You're going to have some of these smaller books that are having a really hard time, like with the realities of what it costs to operate in U.S. markets. Either they were planning all along to get acquired, or they just have to, or they have to shut down their U.S. operations. I think this does keep happening, but you also see, we talked about this earlier, the gaining of prominence of other brands that maybe haven't made like a full-throated entrance yet into the U.S. markets, like Bet365 or Hard Rock, that start becoming more relevant. And I don't think we're anywhere near the point yet where we're looking at this as a mature market and all of the attempts to gain ground are dissipating and everyone just kind of settles into their place. I don't think we're anywhere near, not that markets ever like have a finishing point where it's exactly like that, but you have points where people just say, okay, it's just too hard to like really break in as established players. I don't think we're at that point yet. I think there's a lot of shaking out still to be done over the next several years.
Well, let me ask you about these mergers and acquisitions. I mean, a lot of people are seeing the sports books and gambling operators doing deals with like media companies or other companies that don't do sports betting or gambling directly, but are affiliated with the industry. Do you think this is going to be a big year for that? And do you think those deals have cooled off? And is that a way for sports books and gambling organizations to do a deal with a media company to get a leg into the forefront and get their voice out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it ebbs and flows a bit. Mm-hmm. I think Barstool, I guess, is probably the most prominent example of the thing you're referring to, or Fox Bet, I guess, which we were talking about earlier, right? Where you got some sort of like existing media brand that either gets acquired or brought into the fold or partnered with. There's certainly been a lot of buzz all the time for years about ESPN, right? Mm-hmm. Are they going to like formally ally with a single book, right? Yeah. Obviously DraftKings would probably, give them everything to be partnered with them just because it makes so much sense for them particularly. But ESPN has been kind of coy, and they have these different conversations, like where, yes, maybe they're going to have their own sports book, or maybe they're not, or maybe they're going to do more advertising, maybe not. Like they have different messages that they seem to send out. And then there's also this sort of like there's this backdrop of like ESPN might get spun off from Disney, right? Or might get sold to somebody else or whatever. So that's really the big one. There's obviously there's other media companies in the space that are of interest, but I think that's the really big one. I think that the Barstool thing in particular it looks like maybe it's going to end up being a flop for Penn National. I think that it's going to really make people hesitant about coughing up a few $100 million for some, like, really spicy media brand, which is really the option, right? Like, you can't, you want to run a sports book, you're not going to be able to go buy ESPN.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the option is to buy up something like a Barstool or I don't know, Bleacher Report kind of thing. I know some of these have been acquired, but just these kind of big niche kind of sports sites or networks, or to like partner with an ESPN or a Fox or Bally or whatever. And just the amount of interesting ones that are out there, there just aren't that many. ESPN is like incredibly interesting, right?
Yeah,
but
sure.
I'm not sure there's even like a second tier below that that's interesting right now.
Well, let me ask you, one of the big things and a big topic for a lot of gambling operators is online casinos. I mean, here in New Jersey, where I live, we have sports books like DraftKings, FanDuel, BetMGM, Caesars, but all those mobile sports books have online casinos attached to them. I know Saturday morning, DraftKings has their DraftKings online casino report on television, so there's always that. Now, in the past, states have always been reluctant to allow online casinos. Do you think that's going to change pretty soon? Because, I mean, there's a huge push for online casinos now.
Yeah, I mean, it was inevitable, right?
Yeah.
I do think there'll be more states offering it for sure, just because there's a lot of money in it, and so there'll be a lot of lobbying dollars, and now the sports books, which are also for the most part the online casino providers, really want this, and they're established political players in all these states. So, yes, I mean, I do think it's coming in more places over time. Do I think it's going to proliferate as easily as sports betting did? No, I don't. I mean, I just think it's a harder sell, and they're going to be, like sports betting, every state's going to be different in their approach to this, but there are going to be a lot of states that have an issue with it for one reason or another, or it's just harder to get across the finish line. But at the end of the day, you got a lot of starving budgets in states, and they love, getting more money in for their lotteries and for their, whatever gambling taxes they do, and this will be no different. And in the end, it's going to be an opportunity. They're going to see how much Pennsylvania is raking in off that 50 whatever % slot tax.
Yeah.
And they're going to want to get in on that. So I do think it's coming to more places. I think, DraftKings buying up Golden Nugget is going to be prescient for them. It's going to work out well over time. Do I see it in 30 states in 5 years? No way. But I definitely think there are going to be some states that get involved. And I would bet that 2 years from now, we got at least 3 or 4 more states do an online casino, or at least that have passed legislation.
You just mentioned Pennsylvania. They just went live with Bally's online casino, and that's like their 20th online casino, and New Jersey has 30. I was shocked to find out that New Jersey has a lot of online casinos like that. But why do you think states have been so reluctant to allow online casinos? I mean, they seem to really welcome sports betting, but are really pushing away online casinos.
Well, they're reluctant to allow all of it, honestly. And the reason they're allowing it is because of the money.
Yep.
They just, for the most part, they see an opportunity to, help their budgetary situations, which are probably there are probably 50 challenging state budgets situations in the country, one for every state. And so they see this as a way to help with that. And so I think that it took a while for them to get in the door, particularly in some of the states that have legalized more recently. And every state has its own issues. Some states have constitutional issues. Some states have incumbency issues, like Florida with the Seminoles, and tribal compacts and stuff like that. And so it's tricky. And I think online casinos did not have what the sports books had, which is advocacy coming from well-known celebrities like Roger Goodell, or maybe he wasn't specifically involved, but league commissioners and teams and players, and people that legislatures would have people that would want to get their autographs and stuff like that. I think people underestimate how human people are in legislatures and regulators, and how exciting it is for them to meet celebrities and stuff like that. And the leagues have taken advantage of this. Yeah, it's not just like giving people their favorite whiskey in a smoky room or whatever. A lot of the time, it's just genuinely getting them excited about, what doing this could mean for, them and the states they represent. And casino just doesn't have that. There's no cultural excitement around online casino gaming, right? Like there really is with sports betting. It's something everybody talks about sports all the time. Everybody talks about who they think is going to win games and stuff like that. And just the logical next step is talking about putting money on that for a lot of people, right? And so I think it's just smoother and more comfortable culturally for people. Whereas online casino is really tricky because it's just like a lot of people's first reaction is going to be, is that even fair? Is it possible for it to be fair? Obviously, we know a lot about this. We're in the space, but I think it's a harder sell. It's kind of hard to believe that, if you're playing blackjack online and you can't see the cards, that you're sure that if you, every time you bet more money that the house doesn't take an extra edge or something. Like I understand a lot more about it than the average person, but it's still like, it's weird for me to even think about playing blackjack online. Like, not because I think I have a less chance of winning. It's just like, why?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
but I think that it just takes people more time to wrap their head around it. And I think that's the biggest issue. And poker's this whole other can of worms because it's played peer to peer, right?
Yeah. Well, let me ask you about that. Because just this morning I saw a television commercial for Poker Stars, which is becoming a common thing in New Jersey and Pennsylvania to see these commercials for online poker. What do you see as the future of online poker in the U.S.?
I think it's going to be small.
Mm-hmm.
I just think it's going to be small for the foreseeable future, because it's taking so long to get more states. It's taken so long to get interstate cooperation and player pooling. And it just doesn't feel like a priority to anybody, whether it's legislatures, the gambling companies themselves, etc. The people that are really doing well in poker, like World Poker Tour, for example, just like the big businesses, Poker Go and so on, just aren't the same players as the major players in sports betting, or like the people who would probably benefit from online poker regulation, like, BetMGM and Flutter. So it's really, I don't know, it's tricky. Like, I do think it's going to matter. I think there will be more interstate online poker and bigger tournaments down the road, but I'm just not as sure. Like, there's always all this debate around, the World Series of Poker had such a big turnout. Is there going to be another poker boom? And I hear people say, "Oh, there's no poker boom. There's no new poker boom coming." I just think the answer is it's complicated.
Yeah.
Maybe there just are, because the poker boom happened, about 20 years ago when it started. Maybe there are just a lot of people who were in their 20s then, who are in their 40s now, and have more money that enjoy poker because they were doing it a lot when they were young, and it was something they got into, and now they have the money, and maybe once a year they can take a flight out and play a poker tournament or whatever. And because of that, you got a lot of people with the means who can do something like enter the World Series of Poker. Maybe, right? There's probably a bunch of reasons around all that, but I'm not as sure that there's like a really big mass market for just like sitting online and grinding all the time. And particularly like cash games, God, they're miserable now. I mean, I've played all night at Harris Cherokee a few months ago with my buddy who lives near there. I'd never been there in 12 years living in Atlanta. I'd never made it up there. It was 2 hours from my house before I moved. And, we were drinking, so we were having a good time just playing stupid and whatever. But the games are so slow, so dead.
Yeah.
It feels like such a miserable place. You look around the table, you see miserable people sitting there. And playing a tournament is different. Playing a tournament's kind of fun. It's kind of exciting. Like, the tournament's going somewhere.
Yeah.
But grinding cash just isn't fun anymore. The average player got too good, too tight, and I'm just not sure that there is a recovery from that ever. I'm just not sure because online poker was making so much money off cash games, just
Sure.
running all the time and limit cash games particularly. I just don't think that's coming back ever.
Mm.
So I don't think it's a real big, you know, likelihood that there's real revenue coming from that in the U.S. in the future.
Well, what would it take for online casinos and online poker to really make a dent in the industry? Will it take a big state like New York to say, yes, okay, we're going to have online casinos and online poker? Because let me tell you something. A couple of weeks ago, Rhode Island just made online casinos and online poker legal, and it's great and everything. I don't mean any disrespect to Rhode Island, but everyone said, "Hey, that's great," and then just moved on. Will it take a really big populated state to legalize these two online properties to make it relevant, really, in the industry?
Maybe. It's really hard to say. Coincidentally, I'm going to Rhode Island in a few weeks.
Can you apologize for me? Or
I've only been there once in my life, about 20 years ago, and I was thinking that I was like, I could gamble online while I'm there. But no, I mean, I think it's really hard to tell. I'm not a big believer in sort of this theory that like when a big state does one of these things, that it makes it easier for the other states to do it. Mm-hmm. With online poker, it's a little bit different because the existence of interstate pooling means that a smaller to medium-sized state can legitimately enter into the online poker fray, which just wasn't possible before. Like I remember Delaware had online poker, but like only in their own state for a while. It's like, I mean, there aren't enough people in Delaware to like fill a poker table, like what's the point? So you can't expect that to be anything at all relevant, right? Poker is a game where you just need liquidity, you need critical mass of population. So I think it's very important that you have this possibility of interstate player pooling, which we now have. And that means that, I don't think that a state like Kentucky or West Virginia or, Alabama or whatever, really needs to think when they're making these decisions, like, am I going to be able to have something relevant here? Like they can just enter into what's out there, into that framework. And that helps a lot, but it also means that, big state decisions are kind of less predictive of what the smaller states are going to do. And I think as we've seen in sports betting, it's a different kind of push in every single state. It's a big, hard push. And the New York Times article about the push in Kansas to me really highlights that, because like who gives a shit about Kansas, like anywhere, right? Like no offense to anyone, but I mean, it's just not a state that anyone who doesn't live there thinks about ever. And maybe in the NCAA tournament every year, right? But I mean, again, no offense to Kansas, to be clear.
So in the last couple of minutes,
West Virginia, so I get it. Right?
In the last couple of minutes, we've crapped on Rhode Island and Kansas. So
right,
right.
We're all around. We're all around crapping on small states. But
send all your email to Better Collective.
I'm from West Virginia. I get it. I'm from a small state that also is often considered irrelevant for everything, but. All this just to say that even for these small states that don't have big populations and big markets, you still have like a furious lobbying push to get it done. It's not like Kansas is calling up FanDuel like, hey, what's the best deal we can give you?
Yeah.
So, it's tough, and it's going to be tough with casino, even tougher because you won't have the sports leagues backing you up and all that. So, really hard to say, but I do think we'll have more states like in the relatively near future.
Adam, we're running out of time, but can you give out the website for Better Collective so people can check out all the great things Better Collective is doing in the gaming industry?
Yeah, I'll give you a few. I mean, Better Collective's website is really kind of like a corporate website because they're a publicly traded company. They don't have like any products on bettercollective.com specifically, but for the U.S., I think people will be very interested in what's going on at the Action Network and VegasInsider.com, USBets.com is one of the ones that I work on more closely, as well as SportsHandle.com, which reports on industry and news. We've got all kinds of stuff going on. We also just recently acquired a company called Playmaker that does all kinds of cool stuff on social media. So yeah, you can check us out at any of those places.
Adam Small from Better Collective, thanks so much for coming on and giving us the latest on what's going on in the gaming industry. It's always great to talk to you and get your perspective on the industry. So please come back on. It's always great hearing from you. And thanks for coming on now.
Thanks for having me.
That'll do it for us this week. We'll see you next time on The Turnpike.